A normal person in the 5th generation of their family tree has 32 ancestors. Charles II of Spain had 10. His inbreeding coefficient was 0.254, which is higher than what you would get if a brother and sister had a child together, and he was not some freak outlier. He was the end product of a 200-year breeding program that the Habsburgs ran on themselves, voluntarily, across every generation, with full papal dispensation while ruling half of Europe. In 2009, a genetics team at the University of Santiago de Compostela ran the numbers across 16 generations of Spanish Habsburg genealogy. The founder came in at 0.025. 10 generations later, the last king scored 0.254. In 2019, the same team proved that the famous Habsburg jaw was a direct, measurable signature of that inbreeding on the royal face. Not a coincidence, not a caricature, a recessive trait bred into visibility by 2 centuries of cousins marrying cousins. So here are the 10, the most physically wrecked, mentally shattered, and genetically doomed members of the most powerful family in European history, starting from the bottom. Number 10, Maximilian I of Mexico. Maximilian is the odd one out on this list. He was not deformed, he was not mentally ill, he was just catastrophically naive, which in a Habsburg may amount to the same thing. Born in 1832, younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph I, Maximilian was the liberal dreamer of the Austrian branch. Bookish, idealistic, completely uninterested in the grinding realities of power. When Napoleon III offered him the throne of Mexico in the 1860s, he accepted. The French needed a puppet emperor to legitimize their occupation. Maximilian apparently believed he was being offered an actual job. The French pulled their troops out in 1866. Maximilian stayed. Republican forces under Benito Juarez closed in. On the morning of June 19, 1867, at 6:40 a.m., he stood on a hill called Cerro de las Campanas in Queretaro and handed each member of the firing squad a gold coin. His last words were that he forgave everyone and asked everyone to forgive him, that his blood should end the bloodshed of his new motherland, and then he shouted "Viva Mexico!" He was 34. His wife, Empress Carlotta, had already left for Europe months earlier, trying to lobby every court on the continent for military help. She failed at all of them. At some point during her tour, she suffered a complete psychotic break. She spent the remaining 60 years of her life confined in Belgium, believed to be insane. Edouard Manet painted the execution 4 times. The shirt Maximilian wore that morning, full of bullet holes, is still preserved at the Hofburg in Vienna. His embalmed body was shipped home in a Mexican warship. Maximilian makes this list not because of his genes, but because of what the Habsburg worldview did to a man who inherited the family's absolute confidence without any of the family's survival instinct. The Habsburgs had spent centuries believing that God chose them to rule. Maximilian believed it too, just in the wrong hemisphere. Number 9. Archduke Rudolf, Crown Prince of Austria. Rudolf was the only son of Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth of Bavaria, who was his first cousin. The Wittelsbach line married into the Habsburgs 3 times, compounding a well-documented history of mental illness from the Bavarian branch with whatever the Habsburgs were already carrying. His childhood was a controlled experiment in cruelty. His tutor, Leopold Gondrakow, acting on Franz Joseph's direct orders to toughen the boy up, would fire pistols next to Rudolf's bed in the middle of the night. At age 7, Rudolf was locked alone in the Leinzer Tiergarten, an imperial hunting ground full of wild game, and told to hunt wild boar. By himself, at 7. Empress Elizabeth eventually intervened and had Gondrakow dismissed, but the damage was already structural. You do not fire guns next to a child's head for years, and then wonder why he turned out wrong. By his late 20s, Rudolf had contracted gonorrhea, and almost certainly syphilis from a long career of promiscuous activity. He infected his wife Stephanie, leaving her permanently infertile. He was taking large daily doses of morphine. He was chronically depressed and showing signs of paranoia. On January 30th, 1889, in a hunting lodge called Mayerling, he shot his 17-year-old mistress Baroness Mary Wetzera in the head. He then waited several hours beside her body before shooting himself. The Vatican, pressured by the imperial family, agreed to a church burial by declaring him in a state of mental unbalance. The succession that had been earmarked for Rudolf now fell to his cousin Franz Ferdinand. 25 years later, Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, and the world went to war. One pistol shot at Meyerling rerouted the entire 20th century. Number 8. Juana the Mad, Queen of Castile. Juana is the gateway. Everything that went wrong with the Spanish Habsburgs genetically traces back through her. Her parents Ferdinand and Isabella were second cousins, which is not extreme, but Juana was the mother of Charles V and the grandmother of every subsequent Spanish Habsburg king. Mental illness entered the bloodline with her, and never left. Modern psychiatrists have diagnosed her variously with severe depression, melancholia, psychosis, or inherited schizophrenia. The symptoms were extreme: catatonic states, refusal to eat, refusal to sleep, refusal to bathe or change clothes for weeks at a time, violent jealous rages that, according to court accounts, included hacking off the hair of her husband's mistress and stabbing the woman in the face. When her husband Philip the Handsome died in September 1506, probably of typhoid fever though poison was rumoured, Juana refused to allow his burial. For months she travelled across Castile with his coffin, reportedly opening it periodically to look at him. The procession moved at night, by torchlight. Historians now argue part of this was political theatre, a way of keeping her claim visible by refusing to complete the funeral, but it became the founding legend of her madness and the justification for locking her away. Francisco Pradilla painted the scene in 1877, and the image of the grieving queen beside the open coffin became one of the most reproduced paintings in Spanish art. A Venetian ambassador who saw her briefly in 1505 described her as very beautiful and having the air of a wise and prudent lady. That observation did not save her. Her father confined her, then her husband confined her. Then her own son Charles V wrote to her jailers at Tordesillas with instructions that no person should speak with Her Majesty, for no good could come from it. She died on April 12, 1555, at the age of 75, after 46 continuous years of confinement. 3 different men imprisoned her across those decades. Her father, for political convenience, her husband to control Castile through her title, and her own son who needed her alive so he could claim to rule in her name, but needed her silent so she could never contradict him. Charles V's letter to the jailers is one of the coldest documents in Spanish royal history. No person should speak with Her Majesty, for no good could come from it. Not because conversation would hurt Juana, because it might remind people she existed. The longest queen captivity in European history, and the woman whose genes seeded every catastrophe that follows on this list. Number 7. Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias. Don Carlos had only 4 great-grandparents instead of the normal 8, and only 6 great-great-grandparents instead of 16. His parents, Philip II and Maria Manuela of Portugal, were double first cousins. His calculated inbreeding coefficient was 0.211. He was born in 1545 with unequal leg length, a curved spine, asymmetrical shoulders, a speech impediment, and chronic physical frailty. A Venetian ambassador described him as ugly and repulsive, and noted that he wished neither to study nor to take physical exercise, but only to harm others. The cruelty was not just a reputation. He tried to throw a servant out of a high palace window. He attacked the Duke of Alba with a knife. He ordered a shoemaker to cut up a pair of boots he judged too tight and eat them. He attempted to shoot his uncle John of Austria. He roasted live animals. In April 1562, at the University of Alcala, he fell down a flight of stairs and cracked his skull. The wound became infected. His head swelled so badly that trepanation was performed, possibly by the anatomist Andreas Vesalius himself, the man who wrote the foundational text of modern anatomy. They drilled a hole in the prince's skull to relieve the pressure. He survived, but the temporary blindness and brain swelling left his already violent personality worse than before. The head injury turned a cruel teenager into something genuinely dangerous. On January 17, 1568 at midnight, Philip II entered his son's bedchamber in full armour, with 4 counsellors, seized his weapons, and had the windows nailed shut. 6 months later, on July 24th, Don Carlos died in solitary confinement, almost certainly from self-starvation. The Protestant propagandist William the Silent later claimed in his 1581 apology that Philip had murdered his own son. It was not true in the direct sense, but Philip did lock a 23-year-old with brain damage in a sealed room and wait for the problem to resolve itself. The windows were nailed shut. The prince was alone. He stopped eating, or was stopped from eating depending on which account you trust, and 6 months later he was dead. Don Carlos inspired Schiller's play and Verdi's opera, and his story cemented the black legend of Spain across northern Europe for centuries. The truth did not need exaggeration. A king in armour arresting his own son at midnight is already enough. Number 6. Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor. Rudolf was raised for 7 years at the court of his uncle Philip II in Spain, which is a bit like sending a sensitive child to boarding school run by the most paranoid micromanager in Europe. His parents, Maximilian II and Maria of Spain, were first cousins. The Habsburg inbreeding coefficients for Austrian emperors peaked at Leopold I with a mean of 0.157, and Rudolf was not far behind. He almost certainly contracted syphilis in his youth, which may have accelerated the neurological decline that defined his later years. The melancholia hit him early regardless. Serious breakdowns are recorded in 1578 through 1580, and again from 1599 to 1600. By 1606 he was expressing suicidal ideation. Between episodes he was a lavish patron of art and science, and a genuinely curious intellect. He brought Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler to Prague as court astronomers. He employed John Dee and Edward Kelly as alchemists. He bankrolled Giuseppe Arcimboldo, who repaid the favour by painting Rudolf's portrait composed entirely of fruit and vegetables. During his psychotic episodes, he withdrew into Prague Castle for months at a time, convinced he was possessed by demons. He performed protection rituals using an agate bowl he believed was the Holy Grail, and a narwhal tusk he believed was a unicorn horn, drawing a circle of protection around himself with a Spanish broadsword. He would not leave the circle. The emperor who assembled the greatest cabinet of curiosities of the Renaissance, over 3,000 items including Dürer paintings and alchemical manuscripts, could not leave his own castle. He never married. He fathered no legitimate heirs. He died on January 20th, 1612, shortly after being forced to hand most of his territories to his brother Matthias, whom he had come to believe was orchestrating his destruction. The paranoia may or may not have been wrong on this point. Matthias was in fact orchestrating his removal. Sometimes the delusion and the truth overlap. Rudolf died alone in Prague, surrounded by the largest art collection in Europe, holding a unicorn horn that was actually a narwhal tusk. His cabinet of curiosities, over 3,000 items, was the product of a mind that could not stop collecting. Dürer paintings, alchemical manuscripts, gemstones, clockwork automata, astronomical instruments, all of it acquired by a man who could not bring himself to cross his own threshold. The collection survived him. The Swedish army looted much of it during the 30 Years' War 20 years after his death. The Holy Grail bowl ended up in Vienna. The unicorn horn disappeared. Number 5. Philip V of Spain. Philip was the first Bourbon king of Spain, but calling him a Bourbon misses the point. His paternal great-grandmother was Anne of Austria, daughter of Philip III of Spain, whose own inbreeding coefficient was approximately 0.218. The Habsburg mental illness arrived in the Bourbon line directly through him. Modern psychiatric analysis identifies severe bipolar disorder with a dominant melancholic pole, probable Cotard's syndrome, and obsessive-compulsive traits. Cotard's syndrome, for those unfamiliar, is the clinical delusion that you are dead. Philip spent entire weeks screaming that he was dead. At other times, he believed he was a frog and hopped around the palace gardens croaking. He received ambassadors half-dressed. He refused to bathe, refused to cut his hair or nails, refused to change his bedding for months. He inverted his schedule completely, going to bed around 8 a.m. and rising at noon. From 1737 onward, the only thing that could put him to sleep was the voice of the castrato Farinelli, the most famous singer in Europe, who was effectively held hostage by the Spanish crown for 22 years. Farinelli sang the same 4 arias to Philip every single night for close to a decade. The same 4 songs, every night. The greatest vocal performer of the 18th century, reduced to a human sleeping pill for a king who thought he was a frog. Farinelli could not leave. His contract with the crown was less an employment agreement and more a gilded cage. He was paid lavishly and treated with respect, but he was not free to go because the king could not sleep without him. In 1724, Philip abdicated in favour of his 17-year-old son Louis I, intending to retire into religious contemplation. Louis died of smallpox that same year. Philip was dragged back onto the throne against his will. He died of a stroke on July 9, 1746. His widow, Elizabeth Farnese, is reported to have spoken of the relief it gave her. The irony of Philip V is that the Bourbons were supposed to be the clean break. The Spanish Habsburgs had inbred themselves into extinction. The new dynasty was meant to start fresh. But the Habsburg blood came through Anne of Austria anyway, like dye in a water supply, and the first Bourbon king of Spain ended up screaming that he was dead and hopping around the garden pretending to be a frog. The bloodline had changed. The madness crossed over. Number 4. Margaret Theresa of Spain, Holy Roman Empress. You know her face even if you do not know her name. She's the little blonde girl at the centre of Velázquez's Las Meninas, painted in 1656 when she was 5 years old. She's the hope of two Habsburg dynasties, the Spanish and the Austrian, staring out from what is considered one of the greatest paintings ever made. Her parents were Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. Philip was Mariana's uncle. At the age of 15, Margaret Theresa was married to Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, who was also her maternal uncle and her paternal first cousin once removed. She married her own uncle. She was physically frail from childhood. In 6 years of marriage, she was pregnant 6 times. 4 of those pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Only one child, a daughter named Maria Antonia, survived infancy. Contemporaries at court wrote that the little empress became thinner and sicker with each pregnancy, her constitution visibly collapsing under the relentless biological demand. Leopold called her Gretel. Their letters reveal genuine affection, which makes this worse, not better. He loved her, and he kept getting her pregnant, and each pregnancy brought her closer to death, and neither of them could stop because the dynasty needed a male heir more than it needed a living empress. None of it mattered against the arithmetic. She died on March 12, 1673, at the age of 21, from complications of her 6th pregnancy. 17 years separated the golden 5-year-old in Las Meninas from the dead empress at 21, and the one daughter who survived, Maria Antonia, would carry the highest inbreeding coefficient ever recorded in the dynasty. Number 3. Maria Antonia of Austria. Maria Antonia's father, Leopold I, was simultaneously her mother's maternal uncle, and her mother's paternal first cousin once removed. When the geneticists at Santiago de Compostela ran the numbers, her inbreeding coefficient came back at 0.3053. That is not a typo. The expected coefficient for the child of a brother and sister is 0.25. Maria Antonia exceeded it. She was introverted, depressive, and physically weak. She was married off to Maximilian II Emmanuel, Elector of Bavaria, who was outgoing, philandering, and militarily ambitious. The marriage was miserable. In 6 years she had 3 pregnancies. 2 of the children died in infancy. Her existence mattered enormously to European diplomacy because she and her only surviving son, Joseph Ferdinand, represented the single plausible compromise candidate for inheriting the Spanish throne when Charles II died without an heir. The partition treaties were built around this child. Maria Antonia died on December 24, 1692, at the age of 23, after giving birth to Joseph Ferdinand. Joseph Ferdinand himself, the boy the treaties were written for, died at 6 years old in 1699, 1 year before Charles II. The cause was likely smallpox, but in a child with that inbreeding coefficient, any infection could have been terminal. His immune system was as compromised as his great-uncle's jaw. The collapse of that inheritance plan and the 14-year war that followed, the War of the Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1714, with over 200,000 battle deaths, traced directly to the deaths of one 23-year-old woman and her 6-year-old son. France, England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, Spain, Portugal, Savoy, all fighting over a crown that had no head to wear it, because the family had bred the heir out of existence. The 2 most inbred Habsburgs ever born, and the last thin hope for a peaceful transfer of power that the dynasty's own genetics destroyed. Number 2. Ferdinand I of Austria. Ferdinand suffered up to 20 epileptic seizures a day. He had hydrocephalus, water on the brain, which left his head in what contemporaries called a curious disproportion to his rather puny frame. He had a speech impediment. At the age of 9, he could not pour water from a jug, open a door, or climb a flight of stairs without help. His parents, Francis II, the last Holy Roman Emperor, who reinvented himself as Franz I of Austria when Napoleon dissolved the old empire, and Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily were double first cousins. Ferdinand had only 4 great-grandparents instead of 8. The genetic math was the same as Don Carlos 3 centuries earlier, and the results were just as visible. Despite all of this, he reportedly spoke 5 languages and showed some interest in botany and technical subjects. The brain worked in patches. He could manage a conversation in Italian and then seize 20 times before lunch. The contradiction is what makes Ferdinand so disorienting. He was not a vegetable. He was a human being with functional intelligence locked inside a body that short-circuited constantly. His wedding in 1831 to Maria Anna of Savoy was a disaster visible in real time. His father witnessed him seize violently during the ceremony and exclaimed, "May God have mercy." The court physician had doubted Ferdinand could consummate the marriage. On the wedding night, attempting to do so, he suffered 5 seizures in succession. He and Maria Anna never had children. The anecdotes that survive are the kind that biographers hesitate to print because they read like fiction. Told he could not have apricot dumplings because apricots were out of season, he reportedly shouted, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings." Shown a hunted eagle, he refused to believe it was an eagle because the only eagle he knew was the one on his coat of arms, which had 2 heads. Informed in March 1848 that revolutionaries were marching on the palace, he asked, "But are they allowed to do that?" That last one has the ring of apocrypha, but it has been repeated by enough contemporaries that historians generally accept it. Whether he was joking or genuinely confused remains an open question. With Ferdinand, the line between wit and disability was never clear. A regency council of 3 men, Metternich, Collerat, and Archduke Louis, ran the Austrian Empire for 13 years because the emperor physically could not govern. Ferdinand abdicated on December 2, 1848, in favour of his nephew Franz Joseph. He lived quietly in Prague until his death on June 29, 1875, at the age of 82. The empire that would stumble into the First World War was inherited from a man who could not dress himself. Number 1, Charles II of Spain, El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Charles is the end game. Every marriage decision the Habsburgs made for 200 years lands here, in a single body. His father, Philip IV, married his own niece, Mariana of Austria. 7 of Charles's 8 great-grandparents descended from Juana the Mad and Philip the Handsome. In a generation where a normal person would have 32 distinct ancestors, Charles had 10. The French ambassador who saw Charles as an infant described a child with rashes resembling herpes, a head covered in scabs, and a kind of channel or drainage that oozed from the right ear. He could not walk until after the age of 6, he could not speak until 4, and acquired very little language after that. His cranial bones had not fused at age 3. His jaw, the Habsburg jaw, taken to its absolute extreme, protruded so far that his upper and lower teeth could not meet. The British envoy Alexander Stanhope wrote to the Duke of Shrewsbury in 1694 that Charles had a ravenous stomach and swallowed all he ate whole, for his nether jaw stood so far out that his 2 rows of teeth could not meet. He drooled constantly. His speech was described by contemporaries as locked, with such a fumbling. He suffered chronic diarrhea, edema, recurrent infections, and epilepsy that worsened in adulthood. He was infertile and impotent. He married twice. Neither marriage produced children, because they could not. The 2009 Santiago de Compostela team proposed that he suffered from 2 simultaneous recessive genetic disorders, combined pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis, both rendered homozygous by the inbreeding. 2 separate genetic dice rolls, both coming up snake eyes because the gene pool had been drained to a puddle. Despite all of this, a Savoyard diplomat named Costanzo Operti described him as affable and generous but shy and lacking self-confidence. There was a person in there, trapped behind a jaw that would not close and a body that would not function. By 1698, Charles was convinced he had been cursed. This was not an unreasonable conclusion for a 17th century Catholic king who could not produce an heir and whose body was visibly falling apart. He consulted the Inquisitor General Thomas de Rocaberti, who investigated the matter with the full machinery of the Spanish Inquisition, and concluded that Charles had indeed been bewitched 23 years earlier, on April 3, 1675, by a cup of chocolate containing ingredients taken from a corpse. That is not a metaphor. That is the official finding of the Spanish Inquisition regarding the King of Spain. An exorcist named Fray Manis Tenda was brought from Vienna. During the rite, a demon supposedly spoke through the king and named the Queen Mother Mariana as the witch responsible. The accusation was politically convenient for the faction running the ceremony, which should tell you everything about how seriously to take it. The exorcisms failed. Charles only got worse. The last Habsburg king of Spain spent his final years being prayed over by men who believed his genetic collapse was the work of the devil. They were looking for a curse because admitting the truth would have meant admitting that the family had done this to itself. He died on November 1st, 1700, at the age of 38. He had been king for 35 of those years, though governing might be too strong a word for what he did. The autopsy, reported by Pedro Gargantilla, is probably the most quoted medical document in European royal history. His body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal. His head was full of water. Doctors in 1700 did not have the vocabulary to describe what they were seeing. We do. Combined pituitary hormone deficiency explains the infertility, the delayed development, the small stature. Distal renal tubular acidosis explains the chronic illness, the metabolic collapse, the early death. Both are autosomal recessive. Both require 2 copies of the defective gene. Both become almost inevitable when your parents share most of their ancestors. His death without an heir triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the largest conflicts Europe had ever seen. Over 200,000 battle deaths, 14 years of fighting from 1701 to 1714, all because the last king's body was so wrecked that he could not produce a child to inherit the throne his family had spent 2 centuries warping their own genetics to keep. The Santiago de Compostela team mapped the trajectory in cold numbers. Philip I, the founder, entered the dynasty with an inbreeding coefficient of 0.025. By Philip III, it was 0.218. By Charles II, it was 0.254. Of 34 children born to Spanish Habsburg kings between 1527 and 1661, 10 died before their first birthday. That is a 29.4% infant mortality rate, against a contemporary Spanish village baseline of roughly 20%. Half the royal children were dead before age 10. The village peasants were burying fewer babies than the royal family. Of 11 Spanish Habsburg royal marriages, 9 were consanguineous, 2 uncle-niece unions, 1 double first-cousin marriage. The rest range from first cousins to third cousins. 81.8% of their marriages were between blood relatives. The Pope granted dispensations for uncle-niece and first-cousin unions to Habsburg applicants more than 70 times across the dynasty. The Catholic Church signed off on every single cross. The Habsburgs could not marry Protestants after the Reformation, and no other Catholic house in Europe matched their status, so the pool of eligible partners collapsed to a puddle, and they kept drawing from it anyway. Each generation did not just inherit the kinship of its parents, it inherited the already reduced genetic diversity of every generation before. That compounding effect is why the coefficient climbs from 0.025 to 0.254 in 10 generations. The children of Philip IV and Mariana were genetically like the children of full siblings. The 2019 follow-up study took 66 portraits of 15 Habsburg family members and gave them to 10 maxillofacial surgeons who had no idea what dynasty they were scoring. The surgeons rated 11 features of mandibular prognathism and 7 features of maxillary deficiency in each face. The correlation between inbreeding coefficient and jaw severity was statistically positive. The worst jaw belonged to Philip IV. The least affected face was Mary of Burgundy, who married into the family in 1477 and brought outside genes. The jaw was autosomal recessive. It hid when the gene pool was wide. It surfaced when the pool shrank. By the end, there was nowhere left for it to hide. They kept the blood pure, and then there was no blood left. The Habsburgs are not a cautionary tale about one bad marriage or one unlucky genetic draw. They are a 200-year controlled experiment in what happens when political power overrides biological reality, generation after generation, with institutional approval, detailed record-keeping, and no one willing to stop. The 2019 study that proved the jaw was a direct signature of inbreeding used 66 portraits and 10 surgeons who had no idea what they were measuring. The correlation held. The dynasty wrote the evidence on its own face, and then hung the portraits on the wall for the world to see.